Hello, today we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. We're going to do this actually in two separate parts. So today is part one. And to begin, the first thing I have for you is a question. Has anyone ever treated you differently because of your age, gender, religious beliefs, the way you dress, your sexual orientation, your race, ethnicity, or any other factor? Tell me the story and then tell me how that made you feel. By now, at some point in your life, you've had some case where you've been discriminated against, whether it's for something that was listed in the thing that I just had you consider, or whether there's some other reason you've been discriminated against. And so I want you to keep that in mind while you're thinking about civil rights. Civil rights is more than just a black-white thing. I think oftentimes we think of it as African Americans fighting for their rights, which is a huge part of the civil rights movement. But civil rights also extends to women, it extends to young people, it extends to sexual orientation. There are a number of different ways that civil rights can be violated. And so just keep in mind that it's not just a black-white thing. Sometimes we get that idea that civil rights movement is just about that. So before we go into any of the details on the civil rights movement, let's take a look at the background, kind of looking at what life was like in America that led to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. So we know after the Civil War, we've got the 13th Amendment, which puts an end to slavery. We've got the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equality among all citizens, and it also grants citizenship for African Americans. And the 15th Amendment, which grants African Americans the right to vote. Of course, this doesn't mean that life is instantly perfect for most African Americans. In fact, they will still endure a number of struggles. So one of the realities of life after the Civil War is that although there is quote unquote equality, there's still a lot of segregation going on. And so pretty much in all aspects of life, whether it's bathrooms, whether it's waiting rooms, whether it's streetcars, railroads, in religious aspects of life, in any public place, life is segregated. There are separate areas for white people and separate areas for African Americans, and that is the norm. We don't see races intermixing after the Civil War up until the 1950s and 60s, and really even through the 50s and 60s. So probably the most famous Supreme Court case to this point that we've already talked about a little bit is Plessy versus Ferguson. And we know that Plessy versus Ferguson ruled on the idea when Homer Plessy wanted to ride a white train car. He was just a teeny tiny bit African American. He looked like a white guy, acted like a white guy, but of course he knew he was African American. So he buys a ticket on a train car, sits in the white section, and eventually nobody really notices. And so he says, like, hey, by the way, I'm African American. And they're like, oh, you got to get out of here. And so he sues, thinking that there's no way that the Supreme Court is going to rule against him. This is going to be the case that proves the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, applies to everybody. Unfortunately, what he found is that the court ruled separate but equal. So the doctrine or the precedent from the case Plessy versus Ferguson is separate but equal. As long as facilities are equal for African Americans and white people, then it's okay to have separation. And this is going to begin what are known as Jim Crow laws. Pretty much all aspects of society were separated, especially when it came to public places. There was usually something for African Americans and a separate area for white people, and in most cases, those areas were not equal. But in theory, they were supposed to be equal. So I want you to take a look at these two separate facilities, one for African Americans, one for white people. By the way, as you can see, that the term used back in the day was colored. Do not use that term today. It's highly offensive for a number of different reasons. But take a look, and what do you notice about the drinking fountains? Yep, you guessed it. That this idea that separate but equal, that things are really not equal. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that the African American drinking fountain is nowhere near the same as the white drinking fountain. Separate, in most cases, is never equal. Because you're separating things, they can't be equal. So in the 1950s, there is a little known preacher. He's a young upcoming preacher at the time, a guy named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And his whole approach to handling the civil rights movement is through what is called peace and nonviolent protest. I'm sure you've learned about peaceful and nonviolent protest before. Where did Dr. King get these ideas from? You guessed it, he got some of the ideas from some figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jesus Christ. These were some of the earlier preachers of the nonviolent peaceful protest. And so one of the things that Dr. King was calling for is not to get up and fight and cause a scene, but he was calling for what was called civil disobedience, or the idea that African Americans should just ignore unjust laws. If a law wasn't just, if a law wasn't fair, then the easiest solution is just to not follow that law. And this is going to be quite a different approach. Dr. King seems to really truly understand the idea that if you are going to convince white people to change their mind, you've got to get them to see things from your perspective. You've got to relate to them in a way that they can understand. And so that is going to be much of the approach taken throughout the civil rights movement. So we begin with the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Um, the case begins with a number of different cases. There are actually 4 different cases that are combined, but we know them as the Brown cases. And the Brown cases are going to be fought by a young upcoming lawyer known as Thurgood Marshall. He is going to come up with the idea that if we're going to make this happen, we have to find a way to overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson case. We've got to find a way to prove that Plessy is unfair. Now, Thurgood Marshall, he will eventually become a Supreme Court justice, but at the time, he is one of the prominent lawyers at the time. As you can see, he's African American. He won 29 out of the 32 cases that he fought for the NAACP, so he's quite good at what he does. Anyways, the legal strategy that the NAACP has is to prove that there is inequality in segregation, to prove that separate is not equal. And of course, the easiest way to do this is to look at schools, to look at various different schools. And so that's exactly what we have in the Brown case. And again, Brown versus the Board of Education, it's named for one student, Brown, but she is not the only one. Certainly, there are 4 other cases that kind of get combined into one. You can see in the photo, Linda Brown, she's the one in the middle. Well, the other students are also students who are involved in the Brown versus the Board of Education case. And so what happened is Linda Brown, she lived approximately 4 blocks away from a white school and 21 blocks from the nearest African American school. And so the courts ruled, of course, with separate but equal, that she would have to attend the African American school, even though it was significantly further from her house. And this is going to be, again, the basis of the Brown case. The first thing that the lawyers are going to argue is that by making her go so far away to school, that is not equal. I want you to take a look at this photo. This is school A, and then we are going to look at school B. So looking at school A and school B, which one do you think is nicer? And are these equal? Explain your answer. Next, we're going to look at auditorium A and then auditorium B. Tell me which one do you think is nicer and why? Yes, it's pretty obvious that A are the white schools and B are the African American schools, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that they are far from equal, that the quality of schools based just looking on these photos is not equal. In fact, in general, in most parts of the country, especially in the Deep South, African American schools are receiving 10 times less funding than the white schools. The white schools are spending a whole lot more than the African American schools. So Thurgood Marshall is actually able to prove in the Brown case that separate is not equal. In fact, it is a unanimous decision from the court. All 9 justices agree that separate is not equal, that there's no way that things can be equal if they're separate. Now, the difficult thing is to actually get this implemented. So early on, there were about 500 districts that instantly desegregated. They're like, okay, cool, we're going to do this, but there are a whole lot of other districts that refuse. Some of them we're going to look at in a lot of detail. Places like Little Rock, Arkansas are going to be particularly slow in trying to integrate. And as you can see from these highly racist people in the picture, they are they're equating to race mixing is communism. I'm not really sure how they get that, but that's sort of what they felt. So that brings us to Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. In September of 1957, the governor of Arkansas, a guy named Oral Faubus, refused to desegregate the schools. He absolutely said that the schools would remain segregated because that's what he believed to be right. And he goes so far as to call in the National Guard, so to call in local troops in Arkansas in order to block schools from integrating. Now, not to be outdone by the governor of Arkansas, this is when the President of the United States decides that he needs to do something. He is going to integrate the schools, whether Governor Faubus and the National Guard like it or not. So there were 9 students who did. They were African American and they wanted to attend Little Rock Central High School. And so, again, they would be escorted by federal troops. President Eisenhower will make sure that the federal troops, the national troops, are going to get these kids to and from school every day. And so every day they'd meet in the morning, they'd go into school together, they'd have a military guard to protect them during the day, and that was how they go to school. Now, the difficult thing, as you can imagine, is that although the federal troops can protect them while they're in class, there are a number of places where the federal troops can't go. So places like the stairways, the hallways, the cafeteria there. Of course, the bathrooms are probably a big one. And so a lot of African American, the Little Rock Nine, they tend to get a whole lot of harassed. I think this is the most insulting of them. This is, of course, not real. This is something that somebody made up as a joke, a not very funny joke, but still something. So it says, permit good until May 29th, 1958. That was graduation day. Bearer may kick the rumps of each CHS Negro once per day until the above expiration date. Last chance, boys, do not use spiked shoes. Again, this is the classlessness of people at the time. Probably what's even worse is the Little Rock Nine received lots of threats, including this was one letter that it was sent to one of the students. I mean, think about this. Listen to this. Spend some money. Spend some of the money you are trying to fight white people with and use it to better the living conditions of your race. Get rid of your slums. However, the minute you move into a housing development, it soon turns into a slum. We taxpayers cannot afford many more of your selfish shenanigans. Troops cost money, and we need it for more important things. Now behave yourselves and build some recreation places for Negroes, have dances and barbecues, and try to be happy with your own kind. Stop focusing attention on yourselves and stop trying to cause another civil war. Haven't you done enough? From one who knows the tragedies of integration. Can you imagine? I mean, you're high school students. Can you imagine if you had to shoulder receiving letters like that every single day? Can you imagine what that does to your confidence, to your mindset? I mean, I just couldn't even imagine what it would be like to be one of the Little Rock Nine. The end result is that the first year of integration was successful and that the 9 African American students did attend the school. Where it's not so successful is that the next year, what will become known as the lost year, the governor closes all public schools. And essentially all schools in Arkansas become private for a year. And again, we call this as the lost year. And it is one way that they found to get around the integration issue. So things not going too well over there. The next one we're going to focus on is the Montgomery bus boycott. So if you are familiar with the Rosa Parks story, this is the Rosa Parks story. So the way things worked is the Montgomery bus system, like most bus systems in Alabama and really in most parts of the South, were segregated. The laws in the Montgomery bus system at the time were the first 10 seats in any bus were reserved for white passengers, the last 10 were reserved for African Americans, and everything else in between was first come, first serve. So on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks boards this bus. She had a long day at work. She's tired. She just wants to find a seat, and so she sits in the first come first serve section. Rosa Parks will sit in the first seat where she is officially able to. Now, when she sits there, there's nothing wrong with it. It is perfectly okay for her to sit where she sits. It's the first of the first come first serve section, but a couple stops into her run. Eventually, the white section fills up, This is kind of unusual for a bus in Montgomery, Alabama at the time. Most of the riders, somewhere between 60 to 90% on a daily basis, were African American, but on this particular day, the white section fills up, and that's when Rosa Parks is expected to give up her seat and move to the back of the bus. Rosa Parks decides on that day, I don't think so. She's decided that she's had enough. She's had enough of the hatred, she's had enough of the discrimination, and so she simply refuses to give up her seat. Now, she does it a little bit differently than I would. If I were in this situation, I would have been angry, I would have been ticked off, I would have been gotten off cussing and screaming. I get my money's worth out of it. But Rosa Parks, she does not. She decides to handle things a little bit differently. When the police do arrive, she very quietly gets up. She follows their commands, and she was arrested. And this is where things are going to really pick up for the civil rights movement. Some people call Rosa Parks the mother of the civil rights movement, or the modern civil rights movement, because she's really the unique figurehead. So one of the things that happens is at first it's just another petty crime. Nobody really thinks much of it. But when the story starts to spread of this middle-aged, mild-mannered, kind young woman just kind of walking off the bus and doing everything that she's told to, that's when a young reverend, a young preacher at the time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., realizes he's onto something. He realizes that this is the chance for African Americans to really make a difference because he needs something that white people will empathize with. He needs someone, some kind of story that white people can say, man, that's wrong. And Rosa Parks is the perfect story. She's not somebody who fought back. She's not somebody who caused trouble. She's not somebody who's trying to get everybody riled up. She is simply just this young, respectable young woman. And so when she gets off, Dr. King says, we're going to use this to our advantage. We're going to use the media to tell her story, and we're going to try to gain support. Now, this is going to begin with the Montgomery bus boycotts. So Dr. King decides that he is going to call for African Americans to refuse to ride any bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, easier said than done. You, of course, live in Michigan in the 2020s, but at the time, most of the people in Alabama relied on the bus system in order to get to work. And so, without riding buses, so somewhere between 60 to 90% of the riders, that these are people who are going to have to walk to work. They're going to have to walk in the rain. They're going to have to walk in the heat of the middle of an Alabama summer. It is going to be absolutely excruciating. Some African Americans and are fortunate enough to be able to carpool. A number of churches at the time will buy cars and use that kind of like a busing system, but certainly most of the riders are going to have to walk extremely long distances in pretty nasty conditions in order to get to work. Now, the bus boycotts are quite successful because after 381 days, they realize, hey, we're losing a whole lot of money off this ordeal. After 381 days, the bus companies want desegregation. If for no other reason than they're losing a lot of money, it's an economic impact. But not only that, but businesses in the downtown area start to decline because African Americans aren't shopping as much. So they want bus desegregation, and even some of the white riders want desegregation because when nobody rides the bus company has to raise the rates for the few remaining white passengers, and that's going to make them upset as well. So eventually, 381 days later, the Supreme Court is going to rule in 1956 that all buses should be desegregated. Segregation on buses is no longer valid. It is now unconstitutional. Of course, as you can imagine, not everybody was going to follow that order, just like the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education, but a lot of people didn't follow. Not everybody is going to follow the bus laws. And so there are going to be a number of different cases related to busing. One of the main cases is Morgan versus Virginia, which says that segregated buses are unconstitutional. But again, a lot of states decide that they're not going to enforce that, especially when it comes to interstate travel. So buses going from one state to another, definitely segregation is unconstitutional, but yet states will refuse to enforce that. Which brings us to the Freedom Riders. Beginning on March 1st, 1961, a group of students known as the Freedom Riders, and as you can see in the picture, many of them are white students. It's not just African Americans. but many of the riders, white and African American, are going to join together and they are going to challenge these desegregation laws. They're going to try to make sure that the buses are actually desegregated. So the original plan for the first Freedom Ride is to make the start in Washington, D.C., and then to travel all the way down through most of the Deep South until they get to New Orleans, Louisiana. As you can see in the map, there are a number of other Freedom Rides that get added on because, of course, they want to challenge the interstate busing laws in those areas as well. So things start out, they're kind of going okay until they get to Anniston, Alabama. When they get to Anniston, Alabama, the bus is literally firebombed by the KKK. The KKK holds up the bus. They stop the bus, and then they tried to shut the doors and lock all the African Americans in. Now, if you're wondering where were the police chief at the time, Bull Connor, has a deal with the KKK. He is very sympathetic to the KKK, and so it's going to take him over 15 minutes to get to the bus and to stop the people. By the time things were done, the bus is completely engulfed in flames, and as you can imagine, thankfully, everybody got out okay. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who did get out okay, they were eventually beat up by members of the Klan and members of the local community. People were beat up with bats and lead pipes and just pretty much whatever people could get their hands on, they beat the daylights out of them. Now, if this were you, would you continue the freedom rides? Well, I know if it were me and I just got my face bashed in, I would say no. But needless to say, they begin a second bus ride. They call in another bus and they get that second bus in. And as you can imagine, eventually the second bus gets attacked as well in much the same circumstance. You can see these guys pretty bloodied up from the second bus, but yet they continue on. Now, why this is really important is because it gets the attention of local newspapers. Not only do we see people getting beat up, which is bad enough in and of itself, but what really makes the difference is that when newspapers start to get the image of this, and when they show pictures like the one you see above, this is when white people start to think, what the heck are we doing? How can we do this to innocent African American people, many of them young college age students? And so this is going to be one of the ways in which we start to make a turn on the civil rights movement. Well, that's all we have for today, but of course the civil rights movement isn't over yet. We're going to begin part two. We'll cover the next stage and the next steps in the civil rights movement. Have a great day.